6 true, disturbing camping alone at night horror stories. Story 1. When my wife and I got married, we used to take seasonal trips to the coast of Oaxaca once or twice a year, mainly for the good weather and also to surf a bit. We were both born and raised in Baja California, where we learned to surf, but we didn't meet and fall in love until we were both living in the Midwest for work. The nearest beach for our recreation was just a hop and a step away. We had no friends or family in Oaxaca, so these trips were literally just to satisfy our beach desires, our desire for seafood, and even the desire to be in the sun. Since we had no family to visit, we would simply randomly select a different seaside town on each trip and stay in a new place each time we went. Being young newlyweds, we weren't making a lot of money, and our savings were close to zero. So we had to be economical on these road trips, which meant no hotels, period. Not on the trip, and not after arriving at any village we chose earlier. We drove a Subaru that had a decent amount of space and saved several $100s just by sleeping in it. This was my wife's method of controlling our budget, and being a nature lover all my life, I agreed from the moment she mentioned camping. However, my wife didn't have a traditional campsite in mind. This was in the early 2000s, so poaching camping wasn't as common as it is now. My wife had heard about sneaky camping from a coworker who was a long-distance cyclist. Her coworker explained that while she was on these incredibly long bike trips, sometimes the only place to find safety and rest was in a parking lot or in the green area between two businesses. Riders would carry scarce supplies, just enough to keep them going, and then supplement those supplies with whatever they could buy along the way. These riders would carry light sleeping gear, perhaps a tent or just a tarp, and rudimentary things like sun canopies or can openers to add a touch of comfort. So we started making this part of our trips to Oaxaca. We loaded our Subaru with all sorts of things I imagined the Boy Scouts would pack. Chopsticks, lighters, a string, sandwich bags, and batteries. All the little things you don't really think about until you need them. Everything was stored in a tidy little storage space along with our bedding to make a perfect mobile sleep capsule. My wife even had hanging curtains surrounding the back for privacy. For the better part of 4 years, we had no problems with our urban stealth camping. The only problem we encountered was that many of these coastal towns we visited had fairly strict curfews and ordinances, so we couldn't stay overnight in beach parking lots or in front of shops or businesses of any kind. So we had to find places where people would park on the street. And again, for these small coastal towns in Oaxaca, this was not a common occurrence. Everyone had a garage or driveway, so our little Subaru camper stood out like a sore thumb. However, we always found some small neighborhood or development where people parked on the street. We'd mingle for a few days, maybe even a week, and then we'd leave back home. There were showers and toilets on the beach, all sorts of outdoor amenities. But simply finding a place to stay at night always proved to be the hardest thing. Camping in sight really takes a little more creativity than people give us credit for. During one particular trip, we found it impossible to find a place to settle in. It was our first night in the city, and by this time of night we had been wandering around the neighborhood for 3 hours without finding any inconspicuous place to park. Finally, after following a few winding roads that took us through a more rural neighborhood, we found a small stretch between the beach and a few houses where people parked on the street. We stopped at one end, where the neighborhood ended, and the road receded into the darkness, and we called that our home. We start our usual sleep routines, such as brushing our teeth, washing our faces with water from the jug, getting comfortable, closing the doors, and curling up in bed. However, there was an uproar outside when we heard footsteps and some conversation. Soon someone was getting into the car that was parked closest to us, about 78 meters behind us, far enough away that we weren't really worried. They started the car and drove off the road, leaving us practically alone on the street. Now, there was only one other car parked on the road, and it was hundreds of meters behind us. I was worried that they would soon leave and get a ticket, which really wasn't in our budget. My wife and I discussed our options, but we were a little stuck. After driving all day, only to drive even further around the city, we had no energy to start the car and look for a more populated area. As we were talking, our prayers were answered. From the front windshield, we could see a pair of headlights approaching down the road from the opposite direction and stopping somewhere in front of us. I got up and pulled back the curtains to find a large, dusty pickup truck parked about 23 yards away. But as soon as I saw it, I felt a strange sensation from the bottom of my feet to the top of my throat. Something wasn't right, and I immediately let my wife know. She got up, took a look, and then crawled back under the covers. He said it was unsettling, but we were in the middle of a neighborhood. That was the whole point. We were safe and needed to be incognito, not suspicious, and attract the attention of any passing vehicles. She was right, and frankly, I admired her for her unflappable bravery. But I didn't like the van or how close it was to us. From my position behind the curtain, I watched someone light a cigarette in the driver's seat of the truck and start smoking it while looking directly at our car. I couldn't stand it. I told my wife that I was going to watch for a while because everything was a little unsettling. She said whatever, turned around and fell asleep immediately. I climbed into the front seat and settled behind the wheel. We were parked against the moon and had a decent tent. He was wearing dark clothes, a perfect storm not to be seen behind the windshield. All the time I just watched as the hand came and went with the cigarette butt. There was no smoke coming out of the window, not even a whisper. Anyone who smokes with the windows closed is a complete psychopath if you ask me. That said, my paranoia was at an all-time high. And to this day I've never been so suspicious of a person. But I couldn't leave it like that. After 30 or 40 minutes of just staring at the van, I finally decided I was going to hold on. I'd watch the sunrise if I had to. Anything to make sure this guy got away. I pulled out the jet boil, the coffee maker, everything I'd need to make a quick, quiet pot of coffee. I set everything up outside the car on the ground, on the passenger side, so I could keep something hidden from anyone passing by or watching from their window. He also wanted to force action. I got tired of looking at that truck and waiting for something to happen. So I went out there and essentially offered a challenge to anyone who wanted to upset us. Here I am, out in the open, with no tricks to do. I looked up at the night sky, heard the sound of the heater next to me, then heard the click and bang of a car door opening and closing. I looked and saw that guy. From the windshield, I saw him approaching me from a distance of about 23 meters, with one hand in his pocket. He didn't look scared or intimidating or anything. He just had the energy of a man going to run an errand. I, on the other hand, was a little paranoid, right under my skin. This was what I wanted to happen with my open challenge to the world, but now he was coming at me. I realized that I had bitten off more than I could chew, and now I was choking. I took a deep breath just before I got to a distance where I could talk to him, reminding myself that everything was fine. I had a 35-centimeter Bowie knife by my side, something my wife and I traveled with wherever we went. I planned to use it, hopefully, to scare this guy off at the first sign of trouble, and if not, bury it in his chest before he could hurt me or my wife. It gets to about 7 meters and just stands there, with more of that uncomfortable energy. The more the guy did, the stranger he seemed. His hands went back and forth from his pockets. He ran his hand through his hair a few times, and finally he would get close to a distance where we could talk. He greets me and asks me how everything is going. We shared a very brief small talk before he asked me for matches. The only matches we had were in the car, but I did have a lighter for the jet boil, so I handed it to him and explained that he could keep it. He seemed astonished by this, as if he had never received such a kind act of generosity. He continued to thank me over and over again. After a series of thanks, He says goodbye and stays in the area a little longer before getting into his own truck. I watched him light another cigarette and then just leaned back in the van for some reason, continuing to stare at us. Alarms and warning signs had been ringing in my head all night. But here it was, around 2 in the morning, and I hadn't slept at all yet. My interaction with that guy was very unsettling, but nothing so scary that I had to flee in the other direction. I convinced myself that I was a guy who had been unlucky as I put away my coffee supplies and slipped into the front seat. I stared at the area for a few minutes before deciding to sleep, but just as I turned to climb to the back with my wife, something caught my eye. I saw movement among the vegetation between the road and the beach. It was a shadow at first, but I could soon make out the undeniable figure of a man, one even bigger than the guy I just talked to. He would slide through the brush until he was level with the truck, then cross in front of it and climb into the passenger seat. I was very careful with the handle, as I couldn't hear it open or close when I closed it silently. This guy was going above and beyond to make sure no one knew he was there. Great, not one, but 2 ex-convicts loitering about 30 yards from where my wife and I were trying to sleep. I put the key in the ignition and flooded the area with my high beams right in front of me. I could see both guys sitting in the front seats of the truck, and they gave me a gloomy smile through the glass. The driver picked up the lighter and moved it back and forth in front of me. My wife asked me what the hell was going on, but I just shifted the car into gear and turned around to go deeper into the city. The logical thing to do would have been to pass by, so I hadn't been on that stretch of road, but we were definitely more familiar with the area that was more populated. If I was going to have any advantage, it would be to go where the city was thickening and more people could intervene. I'll never forget looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the truck pull off your shoulder and follow us. They didn't turn on their lights, but they just followed us in the dark. I could only see the grill and headlights by the glare of my red taillights. I did my best to quickly explain to my wife what the hell was going on as she slid from wall to wall in the back of the car. I told him that the guy in the van had just gotten out of jail this week and had a friend he didn't mention lurking in the dark around our car. Since he didn't mention it, I assumed his intentions were probably not good. He was probably assessing our situation, seeing if we had anything of value, that sort of thing. Melina only had to glance out the rear window to see the shiny silver grille of that truck approaching behind us to make her agree that she had made the right decision. It was time to get out of there, and we had to do it now. Luckily for us, the neighborhood led us to a well-lit community. Suddenly, that dusty piece of truck wasn't so scary behind us anymore. In fact, they looked like fools as they twirled and squeaked around. They withdrew after barely a quarter of a kilometer and returned to the darkness near the beach. I drove to the nearest pharmacy, parked under a lamppost, did my best to fall asleep. The worst-case scenario would be to wake up with a ticket, but at the time, he was thankful that he wasn't robbed. We were lucky once again, as Melina and I simply slept peacefully until morning and woke up without incident. We enjoyed the best lunch we have ever had at a local food restaurant. The charcuterie was amazing. We didn't see that van again, and frankly, we lost interest in sneak camping. Since then, they have been hotels and Airbnbs for us. Story 2. Personally, I've only gone camping once, and that was during a 2-day car trip between where I was going to college and my hometown. The trip itself lasted about 20 hours, and the city that was right in the middle of that trip was Cuernavaca, Morelos. I had never been to Cuernavaca, but I guess I had been there once. But I had heard of it like everyone else, which is a paradise for rock climbers, ATV drivers, and nature lovers in general. I grew up hiking and camping, so I was excited to see what the city had to offer for a passerby. While planning this trip, I was trying to keep it as cheap as possible. As I mentioned before, I was in college at the time, and this was my first trip home for the holidays. I was trying to understand how much the trip would cost me, so I could budget it correctly in the future. My first budget cut would be a hotel room. I was driving my old Volkswagen Jetta, and Cuernavaca was such an outdoors-friendly community that I thought there would be a lot of campgrounds in that area. I would simply head to one for a quick 5 or 6 hour night. The day finally arrived. I packed my Jetta and hit the road. Everything went exactly as planned, cutting kilometers until finally, just at sunset, I was about 10 or 20 kilometers from Cuernavaca. It was so flat over there, with no trees or woods to see in the fading light. But I didn't worry. I thought I was going to sleep in my car anyway. I didn't need trees or forests for that. However, when I arrived in Cuernavaca, it was completely dark. I had no idea where to go in terms of camping. This was long before smartphones, so all I had were printouts of Google Maps, which I used to put together a rough idea. I soon found a campground, one just outside the city along the beautiful stretch of the Cuautla River. According to my memory, it was called Camp El Paraiso, something like 4 kilometers east of the city limits. Yes, I looked up if there were camps, but what I didn't learn was that these were highly sought-after paid camps. I couldn't just come in and wear one. As soon as I did, I had several campers from other units walking up to me with flashlights, asking to see a permit or some kind of paperwork that said I had paid to be there. It was probably to keep the homeless away, and after this happened to me 2 or 3 times, I was too scared to stay. I didn't feel welcome and thought I was ruining a quiet night for all these campers who weren't expecting a stranger to pass through their area. After being kicked out of those camps, I went back to Cuernavaca and decided that I would just sleep in the parking lot of somewhere like Walmart or Denny's, where there was a bathroom open around the clock. I didn't really need amenities. I just needed basic things to get there in the morning. I was really counting on sleeping in the middle of nowhere, but my experience so far made me hesitant to even venture off-road. Who knows what I would find there? There was no luck for me in the city either. The place was full of drug addicts and weirdos. Every parking lot I investigated had at least one nasty guy, if not 5 or 6, who crawled around doing suspicious things. This was not what I had in mind for such a well-known destination. Absolutely defeated, I decided that I would sleep in the middle of nowhere. I got back into my Jetta and rode about 3 kilometers south of town and hooked up on the first dirt road I saw. There was a small cattle grade between a barbed wire fence, but other than that, the place was completely open. There were a few cliffs that I couldn't see from where I was, so I decided to park along the small ridge that partially blocked my car. Still very wary of my surroundings, I decided to place one of my blankets that I had over the windshield and front windows to avoid unwanted glances outside my cabin. Then I sat up front cross-legged over the console and the rear in the driver's seat, with my back against the door and my feet in the passenger seat. It definitely wasn't the most comfortable thing in the world, but it had a lot of stuff packed in the back. Plus, I wanted to be ready in case things got weird. I arrived just in time at my place around 9 p.m., much later than I had originally planned. My new plan was to get some sleep and be awake by 4 a.m., get ready and go back to town, refuel, and then be back on the road at dawn, around 5 a.m. It was the bare minimum, but again, that was all I needed to survive, literally, basic survival stuff. Something woke me up in the early hours, just before the time I wanted to wake up. I opened one eye, and outside the Jetta was a big dirt truck, some kind of tractor truck. I was on the move, and right around the curtain I put up, I could see a guy looking at me from the booth. It wasn't even a minute before it set off into the desert, around one of the cliffs, and disappeared. I didn't think about it much more, and tried to go back to sleep. I assumed it was some kind of work, and that this was their pickup route. A truck of that size wouldn't be involved in anything creepy. Not even 30 minutes passed when I heard knocks on the passenger side window. I opened one eye and looked at my watch, just before my alarm went off. I assumed I was going to be kicked out by the cops, or maybe the Forest Service. since the timing would coincide with the truck that had left shortly before. I tossed the blanket down to find an old Chevy outside with a guy staring at me through the glass. I started waving, but before I could, someone knocks on the window just behind my head. They hit so hard that they shook my teeth, and I slowly began to realize that I was completely surrounded. I turned around and sure enough, there was another guy who looked a lot like the first one, plain t-shirt, jeans, boots. They both started yelling at me to get out of the car. For some reason, I agreed. I just wanted them to understand that I was just passing through, that I didn't want problems. This turned out to be a huge mistake on my part. As soon as I unlocked the vehicle, the guys ripped off my doors and pulled me out of the car by my arms and shoulders. Once they had me on the floor, one sat on top of me while the other went through everything I had, starting with my glove compartment. To say that it was a thorough investigation would be an understatement. I watched as this guy turned my front seats around, dumped my glove compartment and console in the mud, and put away everything of value to himself. Coins, electronics, you name it. I would swear I even saw my lighter being taken away, just because it glowed. I explained to the guy who was holding me that I was a college student, that I was from out of town, that I had no intention of causing trouble. I was just lost and trying to get some sleep before getting back on the road. The guy literally made fun of everything I said, repeated it in a silly voice, even slapped me while laughing. He didn't care who he was or where he came from. After a few more minutes, the sun peeked over the hills. Everything was lit up. I don't know how, but I could tell that it made these guys nervous. I could hear the cars on the road, which I thought were closest during the night, and now that I could see it, I was a good 400 yards from the main road. How they had found these guys wasn't quite sure. I thought I had done a good job of hiding. Eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of being on the ground, they simply left. They instructed me not to follow them, not to call the police or do anything stupid, because if I did, they would come back and kill me. They were very clear about it when they told me. Anyway, I had already made my decision. They hadn't taken much from me, mostly some food and what little cash I had ahead of me. After making sure I was okay and whole, I got back to my Jetta and headed back to Cuernavaca. It took me a bit, but after a couple of turns, I found the police department, went in, and made a report. They were quite dismissive at first, as I was a college student with an out-of-state license and dirty as hell. He probably looked like a crazy tramp. Only after explaining where this had happened did the officers seem to take a little more interest. "You said south of the city. How far?" asked one of the agents. I did my best to explain exactly where I went off the road. The officer turned to his superiors, and they talked for a moment, going over some previous reports. It turned out that the guys who had robbed me had been causing trouble in the city for a couple of weeks, and most, if not all of the reports, were coming from the south side of the city. Also, the dirt road I took to sleep on led to a large cattle farm, and I don't mean a ranch resort, but an actual agricultural facility. They even had a mine on the property, hence the big truck that picked me up in the early hours of the morning. A couple of guys had been in and out of the estate, usually in the middle of the night. They would come in with nothing, stagger around the property until they turned on some lights or set off an alarm, then run back into the desert with whatever they could grab. Tools, copper, raw or building materials, literally anything they could sell for a few bucks. My misfortune became lucky for the local police department. I took them to the location where my incident occurred, and from there, the sheriff's department was able to track them down. By the end of the day, they were found hiding in a small cave in a creek that intersected the river. They had water storage, a fire pit, all sorts of things to really give them a decent living. The problem is that everyone caught locals and travelers like me to get everything. After that day, I got all my things back, which, like I said, wasn't much. Maybe 1,500 pesos in total, along with some of my personal things like blankets. I have no idea what happened to those men, But I'm sure the camp was cleaned up, lost items were returned to the owners, and everything else was thrown in the trash. From there, I'm sure those guys were locked up, and I got on with my life. As I said at the beginning, this was my first and only time poaching, and I can confidently say that I will never do it again. Story 3. A few years ago, my wife and I were going to visit her sister somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We are an older couple, but not elderly, not even retired, so we plan this type of trip quite often. Recently, though, or at least in the last 5 years or so, we've been hearing about a new fad called sneak camping. My wife and I found it funny, as we had done this kind of thing for years in many different states and many different cities. However, I admit that we were fascinated. We found all kinds of YouTubers and TikTok streamers, people coming up with new ways to camp in increasingly populated areas. Some of the things that we saw were cool, cutting-edge thoughts, and some of the things that we found were very daring, the kind of dangerous content that was done just to shock and get views, trying to camp in areas with high crime rates, trying to camp without a car or a tent, just crazy, ridiculous attempts to get views, no matter what. Through it all, we liked what we saw and began to incorporate this into our travels around the country. At first, we started simple, just sleeping in the car in well-lit parking lots, then gradually moved to more isolated camping methods. Instead of sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, we were looking for a luxury condo, or even a gated community, somewhere with a little more security. We would follow someone inside, find a good unreserved parking spot, and spend the night without anyone knowing. It would come dawn, and we would get ready to leave and just walk out the exit door as if we had lived there all our lives. It was a lot of fun and always generated a mild emotion for us. Now, poaching isn't exactly the same as boondocking, which was something my wife and I had done as well. Boondocking is simply having to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, usually on public land and without services or amenities. It's essentially like a typical campsite. We liked poaching because it kept us within the city limits, and we didn't really have to prepare anything. We could use our car in a way that we normally couldn't. After a year of exploring and experimenting in the great craze of poaching camping, we decided to try something new on this trip. We visited my sister-in-law, and instead of just using the car, we were going to find a place within the city limits to set up a small camp and sleep in the open air. We had watched enough videos and practiced enough on our own to feel confident that we could get away with it. Looking back, I don't know what the hell we were thinking. This was a definite activity of bored middle-aged white people, if anything like that ever existed. Everything on this trip was going well at first. We stopped 3 or 4 nights up to this point, all of which were successful outdoor adventures. Now we were really in the city, and we had to be careful with the place we chose. After buying some food and stretching our legs, we started looking for a place to set up camp. It wasn't long before we saw this lovely green belt behind a Target store. It had an ominous fence that had no warning. There was grass and a row of trees, and even a small hill that offered a vantage point. Overall, it seemed absolutely perfect and would make our sneaky camping adventure the most eye-catching yet. You can't just go in and start setting up a full camp with people around. We would have to make several round trips from our car, so we wanted the nearby business to be closed, the parking lot to be empty, and a healthy darkness to surround us. We spent some time, ran some basic errands, made sure we had food and water for the night before heading back, and sure enough, the place had emptied. We were ready to do our business. We didn't have tons of supplies or anything like that, but we liked to be comfortable and didn't want to have to go back to our car for any reason. As I've been saying, we took it pretty seriously, comparing every step of our camping to some videos we'd watched. We knew that all of this had to be safe and secret, so we stuck to a certain standard. At the end of the day, though, it was a lot of fun and something to tell our friends. The camp itself was tucked away in a thicket of trees, about halfway up the hill, which kept our tent out of sight from virtually every direction. It was a dark nylon tent, and so small that it blended in perfectly with the surroundings. Upstairs, where the trees were, there was a flat area to put the tent, which also had a cotton awning for 2 people. It was very comfortable and kept us off the ground, which helped preserve our backs a bit. Again, we're older. You can't blame us for preventing aches and pains if we can. Then we settled into a couple of folding chairs that we brought. We didn't skimp on luxuries with the isolation we had back there. We would talk quietly, share a snack, and have some wine. Just look at the sky. It was relaxing, very peaceful. You could hardly tell we were in the heart of a large metropolitan area. Somewhere behind us, we could faintly hear the hum of the freeway. But then we heard something much closer, tires screeching across the parking lot. The hill wasn't so high that we couldn't see over the Target building, but it was obvious that some guy was doing donuts or something in the parking lot. Whenever we thought it would stop, they would just turn the steering wheel and accelerate in the other direction. It was very unnerving, but not enough to scare us or something. Our car was parked there, but there were other cars as well, maybe even night shift workers. It was a sum of vehicles that, hopefully, would prevent any of these guys from crashing into any of them. He calmed down after a while, and soon my wife and I were getting ready for bed. There's something about sitting in the dark, especially outdoors, that just drains my energies. It could be 7 p.m., and I tell you it's midnight. I lose all sense of time and just want to sleep as long as I'm outside. Just as we were about to pick up the chairs and enter our store, we heard that same car pull into the parking lot again, except this time it stopped squeaking. My wife and I looked at each other. That's new. Then we heard a car door open and close, then another. Then we heard footsteps, voices. Everything was getting louder. My wife and I looked at each other in utter terror as 2 strangers pushed back the fence and began walking straight into the green belt we were hiding in. We could hear them clearly now. They weren't talking about anything nice or friendly, mainly violence and drug use. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. My wife started to get up, but I stopped her and whispered to her to stay still. The trees totally blocked us from view. The only way they would find us would be through sound. She sat down, covered her mouth, and just waited. Thankfully, those voices were reduced as the 2 strangers stopped before where we were, in the flat area before the hill. There was a big fallen tree there too, bigger than a car tire, which served as a good bench. I considered camping next to it before, but found it too close to the fence to be comfortable. And thank goodness we didn't, or we would have been discovered almost immediately. Now we only hear these guys talk for a while. Obviously, we didn't know their names, so I'll call them Type 1 and the Loud Guy. At first, they were just talking about getting high and high, but eventually the conversation turned into violence. Things they had done, things they wanted to do, and this eventually led them to why they were there in the first place. "Damn, friend, what time is it? Is he coming or not?" asked the noisy boy. Yes. He said he would be late. He is always late. I can't wait to do this, said Guy 1. Yes, neither do I, friend. This guy is a wretch, agreed the noisy boy. Now they began to ramble on about how they should meet a third person, a drug dealer of some kind. They were going to scam him right there, apparently buying from this guy quite regularly. But their prices had gone up and their consistency had decreased. Addiction turned to despair, and both turned to anger for the Loud Guy and Type 1. Anger they planned to use to rob the person who was causing their problems. Or so they reasoned. We definitely didn't like what we were hearing, but our options were limited. We were outnumbered against these thugs, and had no interest in confronting or meddling in any way. He had a gun, of course, but that was an absolute last resort. It was an unspoken agreement that we could simply hide, remain silent, wait for whatever was about to happen, and as soon as it was clear, call the police and get out of there. The two thugs kept talking about all sorts of nasty and colorful things. My wife ended up covering her ears because it was so gross, beyond just talking about costumes. But the truly vile delusions of depraved minds continued. After a while, we heard footsteps approaching from outside. I prayed it was a security guard or someone, but it turned out to be the drug dealer. They began to exchange kindnesses, shaking hands. This part really felt almost right, as my wife and I were the only ones who really knew what was going on, or so we thought. Then the conversations moved to business. The loud guy started asking about his purchase, and the drug dealer pulled a gun out of his jacket and pointed it directly at the noisy guy's face. "What the hell, man?" he shouted. "You didn't say there was going to be a gun." "There's a lot of things I didn't tell you," said Guy 1. "Now empty your pockets." This whole exchange was a double setup, as Type 1 was never going to rob the drug dealer, but was actually in cahoots with him. Then the second gun came out. They armed themselves, and the noisy boy immediately realized that he was finished. His only option was to get louder and louder, which was easy enough for him, but they didn't let him. My wife almost gave us away when the drug dealer hit the loud guy with the gun. Not once, but twice. It got really quiet. Guy 1 turned it over and started working on it, going through his pockets. Then he literally tied him up like a pig. The loud boy started growling again. "We thought they were friends. It shouldn't be like that," he said. Guy 1 took a dirty rag from the drain and stuffed it into his mouth. After that, the drug dealer and Type 1 checked the contents of the noisy guy's pockets. They even took off his shoes and socks, where I guess they found the real loot. From what we could hear, they found $900 in cash, half an ounce of cocaine, and there was also piano wire in his pockets, apparently a tool of his. Then, the worst thing you can imagine happened. My wife's whole body shook. Her eyes widened, and she let out the loudest sneeze you can imagine. I froze, totally shocked by what had just happened. My first instinct was to say something like, "What the hell?" But I knew that would only add fuel to the fire we had just lit. She covered her mouth and nose and tried not to breathe. He has very strong allergies in the Pacific Northwest, and we had completely forgotten about it at the time. And now we had just given ourselves away. I looked through the trees as the three heads, even the boy tied on the ground, slowly rose to look in our direction. Even the drug dealer briefly pointed the gun at us. We didn't move. We didn't reveal exactly where we were. We knew that the hill was dark and enveloped, especially where our tent was. To our surprise, the drug dealer and Type 1 began to back up toward the parking lot. They shouted a few threats, spoke with an air of bravado, and cast more shadows on the noisy boy, who was still tied up on the floor. My wife and I stood still as they slowly disappeared over the fence and around the side of the building. They got into the car of Type 1, the shrill threat from before. We realized that we had never really heard drug dealers arrive in a vehicle. We assumed that he must have walked from somewhere nearby to remove loose ends. The car sped out of the parking lot and left us alone in that green belt, alone except for the loud guy who was fighting aggressively at the bottom of the hill. We could hear him growl, fight to free himself, but it was useless. After about 20 minutes, he finally gave up, panting face down in the dirt. Honestly, I think he fainted from exhaustion. My wife and I wasted no time and immediately began to dismantle the camp. The chairs first. Then we put all our loose gear in the fridge, stacked up like a big pile. We dismantled the tent as quietly as possible, being careful not to step on anything that could give us away. Once everything was ready, we were ready to run to our car, but we heard something. The loud boy was starting to fight with his bindings again, except this time he was making progress. It didn't take more than a few seconds, and suddenly his arms were free, which quickly lowered to get rid of his ankles. Then he got up, muttering to himself, shaking the dirt from his clothes. My wife and I were frozen. We had no idea what the hell to do. We were already scared enough just at the prospect of trying to pass by this guy. But now he was standing and free. He took one last look at the green belt and then ran to the parking lot. We stood and listened to their footsteps recede until we could no longer hear them, then hurried our camp into the car and set off west. The night wasn't over, and deep down in our hearts, we knew it wouldn't be the last time we were going to sneak camp. But at least now we were doing it with a more realistic experience. It reminded us how dangerous it could be, especially in urban areas, and how important it was to always have a backup plan, something we had never considered until that point. We felt lucky to have escaped unscathed, but we would never forget that night in the green belt. It was the last time we tried to poach in a city, and honestly, it was the last attempt I made at poaching camping. We were past our fashion phase, and we were perfectly content to stay out of any situation involving guys like that. We ended up sleeping in the parking lot of a Walmart about 3 hours away. It was the safest place we could think of in that situation. It was a crazy night, and while we weren't fully prepared for what happened, at least now we're better informed. Story 4. Just a week or two ago, I hiked a long trail in the dense forests behind my village. I lived in a tight-knit town with just under 1,000 people, so we were quite far from the big populated cities. The forests on the outskirts were very flat, with no mountains or hills, but they had some ponds and a few small rivers running through them. I was heading for one of these rivers. I had been there before a few times, though I had never had the opportunity to camp there until that day. As far as I could remember from the previous times, I knew that I was about 3 hours walk away, almost perfectly north. As I walked through the trees, everything was very quiet, apart from the birds and other animals fluttering among the leaves around me. There were no people or hikers, and I didn't plan to see anyone because it wasn't even an actual trail. It was just an open forest. But about 45 minutes from the river, I met someone. We were both walking towards each other, and it seemed that neither of us had noticed the other until we were only a few feet apart, separated by only a couple of trees. I remember having a confused and almost nervous expression as I found it very unusual to meet someone off the trail in the middle of these woods. But the man had the same expression. He was about to break the silence and say hello, but after a second, his face changed to a faint nervous smile, and he turned to walk to the side. I followed his lead and kept walking too. But I looked back once I got a little further away and saw that the man was no longer walking, but running. He didn't say a word when we met, which gave me a somewhat unsettling feeling. But seeing him run like this when we bumped into each other only made it even stranger. It was as if the man didn't want to be seen or didn't care about the almost impossible possibility of us meeting. Whatever the case, I went about my business and got to the river. It wasn't a camping spot or anything like that, so I just left my backpack and tent in the flattest area I could find. Then I lit a fire as the sun was about to set. I threw in a bunch of random sticks and twigs that were lying around and made sure it burned for a couple of hours at least. I hoped to stay awake and wait for the stars to come out so I could observe them far from the village. I can often get a good view of the Milky Way, which is a sight I never want to miss. Hours passed as I sat and waited until a distinctive sound came through the silent woods behind me. Slow, careful footsteps. I turned and looked, not seeing much in the darkness as I looked around, though the footsteps stopped, which told me that even though I didn't see them, they could see me. I bent down to pick up my backpack and grabbed a sturdy flashlight, illuminating the trees. Now I could see decently far away, but as I moved it back and forth, I saw no one. I felt my heart rate increase a little as I felt that unsettling sensation again. Is there anyone there? I tried again. Hello. There was not even the sound of another step. After a moment of contemplation, I began to walk towards where I had heard the sound. I thought maybe there was a chance I was wrong, but I needed to be sure. I carefully passed through the trees, keeping the flashlight firmly pointed forward until I reached where I thought the sound was. I moved the light to my left, looking behind each tree until the light suddenly revealed a large man. It was the same one she had met only a few hours before, and it was no more than 6 meters away. But even with the light on him, he remained still. In a quick thought act, I tried not to react and kept moving my flashlight through the woods, hoping I'd think I hadn't seen him somehow. Then I started walking back to the store, trying to act as calm as possible. I picked up my backpack and looked once more before quickly leaving my tent and campfire behind, heading into the woods along the river. Once I felt that I had gone far enough, I ran as far as I could until I was definitely far from that man. I found a place to rest and stayed up until dawn. I don't think they followed me, as I was able to leave without hearing or seeing that man again. I'm not sure why he was there or why he had appeared and hidden near my camp, but I never got my tent back for fear of what he might find. Story 5. I had taken my RV to a forest a couple of miles from my house. I live in a rural area with a lot of surrounding forests, so camping is quite common around here. The place he had driven to was not well known, being a camping spot large enough to hold only a few RVs. I liked it because there was rarely anyone else there, and the road to get there was wide enough for my RV to easily pass by. When I arrived, the grassy field where I parked was empty. I had no plans, so I stayed inside for a while before going outside and setting up the outdoor awning, then set up a chair and started collecting some firewood to make a campfire. The night was still a long way off, but I just wanted to be prepared before it got too dark. I went deep into the woods behind the RV enough for where I couldn't really see the campsite anymore. A lot of the wood was still wet from a rain we'd had a couple of nights ago, so it took me a while to find some dry bits to use. I had been out probably about 20 minutes, but when I got back to the RV, there was a man pitching a tent nearby. He nodded when I returned to camp, and I waved back, just to recognize each other. I didn't see anything strange about it, and didn't really think much about it, other than being a little upset that I have to share the area with someone else now. After throwing the sticks on the ground, I went back into my RV for some privacy, grabbed a beer, and sat inside with the sunroof open. I'm not quite sure how long I was there, maybe about 30 minutes or so, before I got up and looked out the window. The man had finished pitching his tent, but now that everything was set up, I realized how worn out it was. It had a lot of holes and cuts, with flaps hanging down and blowing in the wind. It looked like an old tent that had been left outside for years without ever being taken care of, and it wasn't even in good enough condition to be better than just sleeping outside. Through the holes, I didn't see the man inside the tent. I looked in the nearby area, but it wasn't anywhere else in the camping area. I got out of the RV and started making my campfire while still looking at the terrible tent I'd set up, wondering why I was using it and how strange it was that I thought it was good enough to use. As the sun was setting, I lit the fire and sat down next to it, still not knowing where the man had gone. I stood there for a while as darkness invaded the forest, leaving only the dim light of the campfire illuminating the small area around me. The night passed slowly as I went, for I began to wonder more and more where the man was, and why he had not returned to his tent now that it was getting so late. I looked at my watch, seeing that it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning, which meant that it had been dark for almost 4 hours. I got up from my chair and walked a little closer to the man's tent, just to make sure he wasn't really there. "Are you there?" I called. There was no response. I stood in the middle of the camping area and looked around the dark forest around me, thinking that maybe the man was lost over there. But as I looked in all directions, uneasiness began to grow in me until a sudden movement by one of the trees made me stop in the act. I looked over to where I saw him, not sure exactly what it was that I saw, until my eyes slowly began to make out the outline of a man standing right next to the tree. He was still, as if trying not to be seen. A wave of fear came over me, and the more I looked at him, the less certain I was that he was the same man I had seen in the shop. I took a few slow steps back, and then hurried into my RV. I looked out the window and saw the man still in the same place and looking in my direction. After a slight hesitation, I quickly made my way to the front cabin and started the vehicle, driving away from the camp. What terrifies me every time I think about it is if that wasn't the man in the tent and just another person standing in the woods. Maybe he did something to the other man, or maybe they were together, and the man in the tent was somewhere else in the woods, staring at me without me knowing. Story 6. 2 years ago, I was living with my younger brother on the East Coast, and for the most part, we didn't go out much. I mean, we would go out with friends a lot and eat something or whatever, but we would never really go out to do anything interesting. I started looking for things to do, and one of the most common suggestions was to camp, because we were right along Appalachia. I told my brother, but he didn't seem very interested. A couple of days later, I went out and bought some things like a small tent and some safety tools, then packed one of my old backpacks and drove to a nearby trail. Yes, I was really inexperienced and camping alone wasn't a good idea, but I only planned to be out for one night, so I figured even if there was a problem, it wouldn't be too bad. After an hour of driving, I reached the trail. There were no other cars parked, and I didn't see anyone else. I went outside and put on my backpack, then walked to the trailhead. It was narrow and not very well made, but it was good enough. I don't think it was a popular path. I just found it by browsing through a large list and chose one that wasn't too long. As I walked, it became more and more apparent how little use this trail was. The bushes were very overgrown and blocked the way, and even in some parts the grass had grown and made it very difficult to distinguish which was the path and which was not. But after an hour, I reached the end. After seeing the trail, it was pretty much what I expected the camping area to be. It was small and mostly overgrown, but there was something I noticed right away that caught my eye. A bunch of logs on the other side of the camping area. I walked over and saw that pieces of charred wood were blowing off in the wind, so it had to have been used recently, maybe even the night before. I looked around again, seeing no tents or signs that anyone had been here, though I wasn't sure. I went to the other end, left my things, and then started setting up the store. It wasn't very dark yet, so I took my time to make sure the tent was well set up. Once I was done, I took a break, sat down, and relaxed for a while. There was about an hour of sunlight left, and I spent it eating and sitting inside the tent in my sleeping bag. After a while, I could tell that the sun was setting, but soon after, a sound came from somewhere nearby, a crackling sound like a campfire. After a while, I unzipped the zipper and walked outside, immediately confronted by a man sitting across the campground, right next to where the half-burnt logs were. He was older than me, probably in his 40s, but I couldn't see much else because of the little sunlight coming in between the trees. He was already looking at me, so I waved nervously. The man waited for a few seconds and then raised his hand as well. I walked around behind my tent and grabbed a bunch of sticks, then made a small fire. It was only a few minutes before it was dark. All that remained was the light of my campfire and the man's fire on the other side. I kept looking, trying to see if he had a tent or a backpack or something, but all I could see was him every time I looked. I just felt more strange and nervous. Where had it even come from? My tent was pitched right next to the trail, so I would have heard him walking unless he came from the other side, which was full of empty woods. I was there for at least an hour, probably 2, and I never saw the man move from his place. He just sat by the fire looking straight ahead. Eventually, I walked into my tent, thinking that I must be exaggerating all of this, and that the man was probably just another camper. After a while, I lay down and tried to rest, but I don't think my mind let me sleep for some reason, so I just looked at the ceiling and heard the barely perceptible crackle of the man's campfire. I was there for probably another hour before I heard the leaves slowly rustling, approaching my tent. I sat down and listened more closely until I could see the shadow of the man standing on the other side of the fabric. My whole body froze as I saw him, standing there for a moment, not moving, not speaking. Then, his shadow began to recede as he heard the leaves rustling in the distance. I quickly unzipped the tent and looked outside. The camping area was empty. The man was gone, leaving only the burning logs. I started picking everything up, pushing the tent inside its bag, and even breaking some of the rods to move faster. I left without ever seeing the man come back. As for what happened there, or what was going to happen, I really don't know.